Welcome to Coders Place YouTube channel. In this video we will see some important questions on Spring Boot, which are mostly asked in interview for freshers. Question 1. What is Spring Boot? Spring Boot is a Java-based Spring framework used for rapid application development, to build standalone microservices. It has extra support of auto-configuration and embedded application server like Tomcat, Jetty, etc. Question 2. What are the advantages of using Spring Boot? The advantages of Spring Boot are listed below. First, easy to understand and develop Spring applications. Second, Spring Boot is nothing but an existing framework with the addition of an embedded HTTP server and annotation configuration, which makes it easier to understand and faster the process of development. Third, increases productivity and reduces development time. Fourth, minimum configuration. Fifth, we don't need to write any XML configuration, only a few annotations are required to do the configuration. Question 3. Features of Spring Boot that make it different? 1. Creates standalone Spring application with minimal configuration needed. 2. It has embedded Tomcat, Jetty, which makes it just code and run the application. 3. Provide production-ready features such as metrics, health checks, and externalized configuration. 4. Absolutely no requirement for XML configuration. Question 4. What are the Spring Boot key components? Below are the 4 key components of Spring Boot. 1. Spring Boot auto configuration. 2. Spring Boot CLI. 3. Spring Boot starter POMs. 4. Spring Boot actuators. Question 5. Why Spring Boot over Spring? Below are some key points which Spring Boot offers but Spring doesn't. 1. Starter POM. 2. Version management. 3. Auto configuration. 4. Component scanning. 5. Embedded server. 6. Actuators. Question 6. What does the @Spring Boot application annotation do internally? The @Spring Boot application annotation is equivalent to using @configuration, @enable auto configuration, and @component scan with their default attributes. Spring Boot enables the developer to use a single annotation instead of using multiple. But, as we know, Spring provided loosely coupled features that we can use for each annotation as per our project needs. Question 7. What is the starter dependency of the Spring Boot module? Spring Boot provides numbers of starter dependency. Here are the most commonly used: data JPA starter, test starter, security starter, web starter, mail starter, thymeleaf starter. Question 8. How does Spring Boot works? Spring Boot automatically configures your application based on the dependencies you have added to the project by using annotation. The entry point of the Spring Boot application is the class that contains @Spring Boot application annotation and the main method. Spring Boot automatically scans all the components included in the project by using @component scan annotation. Question 9. What is the purpose of using @component scan in the class files? Spring Boot application scans all the beans unpackaged declarations when the application initializes. You need to add the @component scan annotation for your class file to scan your components added to your project. Question 10. What are starter dependencies? Spring Boot Starter is a Maven template that contains a collection of all the relevant transitive dependencies that are needed to start a particular functionality. Like we need to import Spring Boot Starter web dependency for creating a web application. Question 11. What is Spring Initializer? Spring Initializer is a web application that helps you to create an initial Spring Boot project structure and provides a Maven or Gradle file to build your code. It solves the problem of setting up a framework when you are starting a project from scratch. Question 12. What is Spring Boot CLI and what are its benefits? Spring Boot CLI is a command line interface that allows you to create a Spring-based Java application using Groovy. Example, you don't need to create getter and setter method or access modifier, return statement. If you use the JDBC template, it automatically loads for you. Question 13. How does a Spring Boot application get started? Just like any other Java program, a Spring Boot application must have a main method. This method serves as an entry point, which invokes the Spring application #run method to bootstrap the application. Question 14. What are the basic annotations that Spring Boot offers? The primary annotations that Spring Boot offers reside in its org.springframework.boot.au to configure and its subpackages. Here are a couple of basic ones. 11. At enable auto configuration, it is used to make Spring Boot look for auto configuration beans on its class path and automatically apply them. 2. At Spring Boot application, it is used to denote the main class of a boot application. This annotation combines at configuration, at enable auto configuration, and at components canned annotations with their default attributes. Question 15. What is Spring Boot dependency management? Spring Boot dependency management is used to manage dependencies and configuration automatically without you specifying the version for any of that dependencies. Question 16. Can we create a non-web application in Spring Boot? Yes, we can create a non-web application by removing the web dependencies from the class path along with changing the way Spring Boot creates the application context. Question 17. Is it possible to change the port of the embedded Tomcat server in Spring Boot? Yes, it is possible. By using the server.port in the application.properties. Question 18. Can we override or replace the embedded Tomcat server in Spring Boot? Yes, we can replace the embedded Tomcat server with any server by using the starter dependency in the pom.xml file. Like you can use Spring Boot Starter Jetty as a dependency for using a Jetty server in your project. Question 19. Can we disable the default web server in the Spring Boot application? Yes, we can use application.properties to configure the web application type, i.e. spring.main.webApplicationType equals none. Question 20. How to disable a specific auto configuration class? You can use exclude attribute of at enable auto configuration if you want auto configuration not to apply to any specific class. Question 21. Explain at REST controller annotation in Spring Boot. It is a combination of at controller and at response body, used for creating a RESTful controller. It converts the response to JSON or XML. It ensures that data returned by each method will be written straight into the response body instead of returning a template. Question 22. What is the difference between at REST controller and at controller in Spring Boot? At controller map of the model object to view or template and make it human readable, but at REST controller simply returns the object and object data is directly written in HTTP response as JSON or XML. 23. What is Spring Actuator? What are its advantages? An actuator is an additional feature of Spring that helps you to monitor and manage your application when you push it to production. These actuators include auditing, health, CPU usage, HTTP hits, and metric gathering, and many more that are automatically applied to your application. 24. How to enable actuator in Spring Boot application. To enable the Spring Actuator feature, we need to add the dependency of Spring Boot Starter Actuator in pom.xml. Below is the syntax for actuator dependency. 25. What are the actuator-provided endpoints used for monitoring the Spring Boot application? Actuators provide below predefined endpoints to monitor our application. 1.health, 2.info, 3.beans, 4.mappings, 5.config props, 6.hituptrace, 7.heapdump, 8.threaddump, 9.shutdown. Question 26. How to check the environment properties in your Spring Boot application. Spring Boot Actuator/env returns the list of all the environment properties of running the Spring Boot application. Question 27. How to enable debugging log in a Spring Boot application. Debugging logs can be enabled in three ways. 1. We can start the application with debug switch. 2. We can set the logging.level.route equals debug property in application.property file. 3. We can set the logging level of the root logger to debug in the supplied logging configuration file. Question 28. Where do we define properties in the Spring Boot application? You can define both application and Spring Boot related properties into a file called application.properties. You can create this file manually or use Spring Initializer to create this file. You don't need to do any special configuration to instruct Spring Boot to load this file. If it exists in class path, then Spring Boot automatically loads it and configure itself and the application code accordingly. Question 29. What is an IOC container? IOC container is a framework for implementing automatic dependency injection. It manages object creation and its lifetime and also injects dependencies into the class. Question 30. What is the default port of Tomcat in Spring Boot? The default port of the Tomcat server port is 8080. It can be changed by adding server.port properties in the application.property file. Question 31. What is the difference between request mapping and get mapping? Request mapping can be used with get, post, put, and many other request methods using the method attribute on the annotation. Whereas get mapping is only an extension of request mapping which helps you to improve on clarity on request. Question 32. What is the use of profiles in Spring Boot? While developing the application, we deal with multiple environments such as dev, QA, prod, and each environment requires a different configuration. For e.g., we might be using an embedded H2 database for dev, but for prod, we might have proprietary Oracle or DB2. Even if DBMS is the same across the environment, the URLs will be different. To make this easy and clean, Spring has the provision of profiles to keep the separate configuration of environments. Question 33. How to get the list of all the beans in your Spring Boot application? Spring Boot actuator/beans is used to get the list of all the Spring beans in your application. Question 34. What is dependency injection? The process of injecting dependent bean objects into target bean objects is called dependency injection. Setter injection. The IOC container will inject the dependent bean object into the target bean object by calling the setter method. Constructor injection. The IOC container will inject the dependent bean object into the target bean object by calling the target bean constructor. Field injection. The IOC container will inject the dependent bean object into the target bean object by reflection API. Thanks for watching us. If you like our content, then please share it and subscribe to our channel.
खत्म।